All right, well, I'd like to welcome everybody back. And today we're going to talk about St. Francis de Sales and St. John Bosco. Why is St. John Bosco such an important person for, or St. John Bosco, why does he choose Francis de Sales? What's so important about St. Francis de Sales? So let's look at this. And what is the source of Don Bosco's family spirit? And he sees this in Francis de Sales. Now, so just to look at this, to say this, a preliminary observation. There was the Salesian historian, Don Pietro Stella, born in 1930, died in 2007. And I knew him, I took courses from him. I knew him when I was very young as well. And we were friends. And one of his questions was, well, why does Don Bosco choose Francis de Sales? Why choose the name Salesian if we're working for adolescents and young people? And is there that's the first question. Why Salesian? Why not Bosconian? We're not Bosconians, we're Salesians. What was a spiritual relationship between Don Bosco, the Salesians, and Francis de Sales, Bishop of Geneva? There's a 200-year difference, very different social class, very different cultures. So what's the connection? So what I'm going to do here is use some of the ideas from Father Stella. And what can we say this? He talks about an educative spirit. And where does he get this? He looks at what Father Giovanni Battista Lemoine writes in the biographical memoirs, precisely in volume 2. In the 19 volumes, the first volume is the infancy of Don Bosco, and he's ordained volume 2, and that's the first years of his apostolate. So right there in volume 2, Father Lemoine makes this statement that Don Bosco thought that the spirit of St. Francis de Sales was the most appropriate for education and for the instruction of poor young people. So what was there? Here's the question. Salesian? Why this name? And what does Don Bosco say anything about this? Well, actually he does. And in his book, The Memoirs of the Oratory, Don Bosco recalls his choices during his first years of priesthood, his first years of pastoral activity. And what do we find him? This is what he says. He says, the Marchesa Giulietta Colbert di Barolo, the Marchesa Barolo, the Marchioness Barolo, she intended to found a congregation of priests under the protection of St. Francis de Sales. And for this reason, at the little hospital, little clinic of St. Philomena, which you see in this photograph. So the two nuns are walking towards the gate there in the back, and on their right is the little hospital, little clinic. This was being built when Don Bosco was ordained, and his first job in 1844 was here, but the clinic was not yet open. Inside the clinic, however, inside the little hospital, the Marchioness put a painting of St. Francis de Sales right at the entrance. Why did she do that? Because she wanted to found an order of priests for her charities. She'd already founded 2 orders of nuns with her husband, and now they were under an order of priests. And so that's why she had St. Francis de Sales. Don Bosco says, when we started the oratory there at that hospital being built, there was the portrait, the painting of Francis de Sales. And so we naturally talked about Francis de Sales. So that's what he says. That's the reason. However, then he goes on to say this. We had to put our own ministry, which called for great calm and meekness, under the protection of this saint, in the hope that he might obtain for us from God the grace of being able to imitate him in his extraordinary meekness in winning souls. So who were the young of the oratory then? Some rough kids. And so we wanted to imitate his meekness to win them over. And then he puts a third paragraph. We had further reason of placing ourselves under the protection of this saint, that from heaven he might help us to imitate him in combating the errors against religion, especially Protestantism, which was beginning to gain ground in our provinces, and more especially in the city of Turin. Really? Combating the errors of Protestantism, gaining ground, especially in Turin? Is this a real thing? And Father Eugenio Ceria, who became the second biographer of Don Bosco, who continued the biographical memoirs, he was looking at these statements and he said, no, this can't be true. He's the one who edited the memoirs of the oratory. And he says, there were no Protestants in 1848. Not in Turin. It wasn't until 1849 that the king, Charles Albert, granted a constitution which gave freedom of worship to everyone, even though he also decreed that Piedmont was a Catholic state, a Catholic country, but there was freedom of religion for everyone. That's 1849. And Don Bosco was talking about 1846 and starting with Francis de Sales. So Father Ceria says, this can't be, but you know, he is writing these memoirs in 1874 to 1877, 30 years after the founding. And so is he mixing up the dates, or does he have another thing in mind? Because certainly in 1870, there were many Protestants coming into Turin. Well, not Protestants, they weren't Protestant at all. They were Waldensians, which are older than Protestants. From the 1300s, and they're very anti-Catholic, and they were arriving in Turin in the 1870s, and that's when Don Bosco was writing for his young Salesians. So Ceria says, but we already had the name Salesian. We had the name Salesian already in the 1850s, but already in the 1840s, there was Francis de Sales, and the young people were calling Don Bosco and the young clerics, seminarians working with him, Salesian. So Ceria says, this cannot be the reason for choosing Francis de Sales, because he says to fight the Protestants, there were none in 1846. So he looks for something, and he finds this in 1848. Don Bosco was asked by the Archbishop of Turin to head up a work of putting all the youth centers and youth programs in the archdiocese together and to work together. And so he founds a group called the Congregation of St. Francis de Sales. By using the word congregation, he met a network. And in writing about this congregation, this network, he explains why Francis de Sales, and he talks about the oratory that he founded. And he said, this oratory is placed under the patronage of St. Francis de Sales, because those who intend to dedicate themselves to this kind of work should adopt this saint as a model of charity and affability. Charity and affability are the sources of the good fruit that we expect from the work of the oratories. So here's that phrase, and I highlighted those things. Place it under the protection of Francis de Sales, dedicate ourselves as this saint did, because he's a model of the virtues and the sources that will give us the good fruit. What are those sources? What are those virtues? Charity and affability, approachability, gentleness. Key words here, key words, under the protection. Dedicate themselves, virtues as sources, good fruits that we expect, and adopt this model. The model is Francis de Sales. Now, the question is, was Francis de Sales a very popular saint, a national saint? No, not at all. In fact, look at the farmers. Farmers never demanded any images of the Bishop of Geneva. Many of the prayers and the pilgrimages and novenas were made to miracle worker saints, but Francis de Sales was not a miracle worker saint. What about the seminarians? Well, you know, the Council of Trent had wanted more model bishops, and in the 1700s, Francis de Sales and Charles Borromeo were declared the patrons of bishops, but the bishops didn't pay attention. And then there was the French Revolution, and the revolution complained about the church, which was getting rich off the poor, many criticism of the church. So in the 1800s, the church tries again, and instead of presenting them as models for bishops, they present them as models for seminarians. Why Charles Borromeo, Archbishop of Milan in the 1500s? Because he continues to reform the church in Milan after the example of the Council of Trent. And also, he tries to bring the Diocese of Milan, which was the largest diocese of the church, to conform to the gospel. Francis de Sales, why? He was known as a good shepherd. He had pastoral zeal. He did everything he could for the people. And in this pastoral zeal of his, he reformed the church. He reformed the clergy. And a third model in the 19th century, in the 1800s, was Philip Neri, who had a generous heart, was aflame with the love of God and bringing joy to the people of God, especially young people. And the seminary where Don Bosco went had Francis de Sales, Charles Borromeo, and Philip Neri as the three patron saints. So before Don Bosco was a priest, he already knew of Francis de Sales from his seminary days, linked with the two other pastoral saints. Now, we know Don Bosco takes this into consideration because on the eve of his ordination, he takes a 10-day retreat in 1841 from May, the end of May, the beginning of June, and he was ordained on May 5th, 1841. He wrote 10 resolutions, one for each day of his retreat. And the fourth resolution was this: may the charity and gentle kindness of Francis de Sales be my guide in all things. Gentle kindness, the word Don Bosco used in Italian was dolcezza. Dolcezza means sweetness. May the charity and sweetness of Francis de Sales be my guide in all things. We find this in the biographical memoirs. You know, right after he was ordained, he goes to the Convito Ecclesiastico for a course in pastoral theology to learn how to be a priest, how to do pastoral work. And he was thinking he would go to the parish out in the country again. Well, the Convito Ecclesiastico followed the advice of a priest by the name of Pio Brunone Lanteri. And Pio Lanteri always spoke about Francis de Sales as the wise and faithful shepherd. One of the instructors at the Convito when John Bosco arrives was a young priest from his own town. That was St. Joseph Cafasso. And he is always presenting Francis de Sales as a gentle and loving shepherd in the face of the rigorism, the toughness of the Jansenist heresy of the 1800s. And the words that Cafasso uses are dolcezza e carità, the same words that John Bosco put in his resolution. Now he goes to the Convito and he meets Cafasso, who is talking about Francis in the same way. And so for Don Cafasso, he presents Francis de Sales as a model for priests, because to win souls means you fight sin. One implies the other. So the spiritual combat of the shepherd is to win souls for Jesus Christ. So what should the cry of the good shepherd be? And Don Cafasso says, give me souls, take away the rest. Or da mihi animas cetteratole. We have retreats that he preached. I have a copy of one that I found a book when I was there as a student that they were going to throw out of the library. So I took that book, and there he has a whole retreat for priests. And he's saying to them, who is our model? Francis de Sales, and his cry, da mihi animas, give me souls. When you're tired and you can't go on with your work, cry out to God, give me souls. When you're working and you're frustrated because no one is responding to your efforts, shout out to God, give me souls. The retreat gets more and more, and it goes from just the phrase to capital letters to dark capital letters, as if he's shouting out loud, give me souls. And we know Don Bosco goes on these retreats with Don Cavasso, and it's around that time that he makes up his sign that he put in his office, Da mihi animus ceteratole. For many people, there are many patron saints, but for Don Bosco, there was only one patron. That's Holy Mary, only Mary. And he proposes only Mary, most holy, as the patron, because she is the mother and patroness of every condition of Christian life. He doesn't look to saints as patrons and not as protectors, but as models of how to live as a Christian. And so he presents Francis de Sales as a model for catechists. Don Cavasso presented him as a model for priests. Don Bosco presents Francis as a model for catechists. Who were the catechists? These were young people. These were teenage boys who were helping to teach catechism to the children preparing for First Communion. So he has teenagers and young adults, and he presents them Francis de Sales. What about Francis de Sales did the catechists need to learn? To steep themselves in the Word of God, to open themselves up to dialogue. You don't force young people. Dialogue, talk with them, get them to understand God's call in their life. Dialogue, but also to always be gentle and approachable and accessible. And Francis de Sales models this for them. So we see this and we realize this is really how Don Bosco thinks, right? We know that he writes the biography, for instance, of St. Joseph. How can you write a biography of St. Joseph? In the whole New Testament, he doesn't even speak once. So what do we know for the biography? But he presents what he understands as the good father, as the hard worker, as the one who takes care of Jesus, who shelters Jesus and Mary. And so he writes this life of St. Joseph. Why? Because many of his young boys were artisans, craftsmen. They would get married, they would have children. So who was their model for them? He wanted them to have Joseph as their model. So he writes a life of St. Joseph as a model. He writes the life of Luigi Camolo, his friend, his best friend, when he was in secondary school and when he was in the seminary. And we know Luigi Camolo died as a seminarian. So Don Bosco, 2 years after he was ordained, he wrote a book, the life of Luigi Camolo, to give to the seminarians in Chieri, because they didn't know him. They came in after him. So he wanted to have this memory of this very model seminarian. What does it take to be a good seminarian? So he writes the life of Camolo. But we know that even for the oratory boys, he writes about those boys who were outstanding in their goodness, in their conversion. Michael Magone converted from being a rough kid to being a very good Christian boy. Francesco Besuco, who was a very good Christian boy and grows from being a good Christian boy to being a good leader. Dominic Savio, who comes to the oratory already a leader and converts to becoming a saint. This is the progressive nature of the preventive system. And so in the preventive system, the models, that's not just 3 stories of 3 biographies. It's a progression of life to go from being wild to being Christian, to being a leader, to being holy. There it is. So the modeling. And so Francis, for Don Bosco, is a model. If Mary's the patroness of the Salesian family, Francis de Sales has a more concrete role. And then we see the references that Don Bosco makes to Francis de Sales while he's training his assistants, while he's forming his young priests, while he's working with laymen who come to help him to reach out to young people at risk. He's always bringing up Francis de Sales, who is gentle, who is kind, who has the heart of a shepherd. Now, how much did Don Bosco know about this? Well, Father Lemoine affirms in the biographical memoirs, and also in his 2-volume life of Don Bosco, he says Don Bosco had a detailed knowledge of the life and the works of Francis de Sales. And I'm quoting him in volume 2 of the memoirs, where he says, now and again, he went reminding his boys in his talks with a story now, a fact later, of Francis de Sales. So always reminding them of Francis de Sales. So what do we see here? This is what Father Lemoine tells us, and Father Francesia tells us, that when they were boys, when they were young Salesians, Don Bosco presents Francis de Sales even to the teenagers, quoting his life, his works, his mottos, his maxims, his proverbs, that Don Bosco portrays the gentleness of Francis as a key to bringing many people back to the church. And he speaks of his overcoming a hot temper and impatience to become a model of gentleness. That's how he presents him. So the key word here is model. Don Bosco knows the most important things of Francis's writings. We know that he knows the introduction to About Life. We know that he knows the treatise on the love of God because he quotes these books. He paraphrased these books, where in the Companion of Youth, in his Life of Dominic Savio, he paraphrases statements out of these two books of Francis de Sales. We also know that he knows the life of Francis de Sales, which he read from Jean-Pierre Camus, who was the only bishop that Francis de Sales ever ordained, and also by Pier Giacinto Galizia, who was from Turin and who in the 1700s published a good Italian life of Francis de Sales for the Visitation nuns who no longer knew French. Now, Don Bosco gives Francis de Sales a very honored place in his story of the church, the Storia Ecclesiastica, so his history of the church, where he gives him 2 full pages. Most other people in the history of the church, he gives maybe 2 sentences, but Francis de Sales, he gives 2 pages. So as a model, he sees Francis de Sales also as a model for missionaries. And for instance, we know when he sends the first missionaries from Torino to America, to Argentina, he says, he writes some notes for John Caliero, who had been with him since John Caliero was 12 years old. He'd been with Don Bosco. He knew Don Bosco very well. And Don Bosco tells him, it'll be with the gentleness and the kindness of St. Francis de Sales that the Salesians will attract entire populations to Jesus Christ. So very important, this phrase. So that's his send off to the missionaries as they're getting on the ship. He gives them words of advice, but the most important advice, the gentle kindness of Francis de Sales. So for Don Bosco, Francis de Sales is all about, we can say, Catholic action. In 1877, Pope Pius IX named Francis de Sales a doctor of the church. At Vatican I, many bishops were asking for him to be declared a doctor. But as you know, Vatican I ended too abruptly, ended fast, as the Italians from the south and the north were invading Rome. Rome was a separate country when the council began in 1869. 1870, Rome was invaded. Rome becomes the capital of Italy, and the Pope goes into the Vatican behind the walls. So what does he do? He remembers that, and in 1877, he declares Francis de Sales a doctor of the church. To celebrate that, Don Bosco launched the Salesian Bulletin. What was the Salesian Bulletin about? To tell about what the Salesians were doing? No, to spread knowledge of the Salesian spirit and action among Catholic people. First of all in Italy, and then it was translated into French, into Spanish, into English during Don Bosco's lifetime, already being translated into Portuguese. And so it was already being spread in these languages. So it wasn't about everything the Salesians were doing, but it was about the Salesian spirit. That's why he launched the Salesian Bulletin. And so we see that for him, Francis de Sales had this spirit that would help Christian educators. Now, here's what we're talking about. When you see the letter that he writes, Don Bosco writes from Rome in 1884, the famous letter of 1884, he says this: charity is made visible in affection. It is charity, love of neighbor, which gives unity to the educative spirituality. And it constitutes the core value of education. And this reconnects us to St. Francis de Sales. And then he says in that letter, let us agree on this. The spirit of St. Francis de Sales must reign among us in the charity of those who command and in those who obey. So important for him, this charity, that is love of neighbor. And for Francis de Sales, charity meant love of God, love of neighbor, all at one time. So here it is, Salesian spirit in action. And if we look at it, what Don Bosco was trying to teach and using Francis de Sales as a model are a couple of things, which we find in our regulations. One, a preferential love for young people. Two, gentleness and affection as an expression of spiritual fatherhood and spiritual motherhood. Three, a family environment and spirit. Four, optimism that overcomes everything. That is, optimism as contagious joy, joy that catches fire. This is Salesian spirit for Don Bosco that comes from Francis de Sales. So in conclusion, we can say, is there an identity between Don Bosco and Francis de Sales? I quoted from the beginning Father Pietro Stella, and he was saying, no, their ideas are not identical, but, excuse me, Don Bosco has an affinity, that is a closeness for Francis de Sales. There's a compatibility. And we could say, as Francis de Sales says, to be devoted to God and devoted to neighbor, so Don Bosco knows devotion to God and devotion to the young, to those in need, to poor souls. This is important. That is what he gets from Francis. He sees Francis de Sales as the zealous pastor and doctor of charity. We find that in our Constitution's Article 9. And in Biographical Memoirs, Volume 9, Father Lemoine says this: St. Francis de Sales served as Don Bosco's guide, even in his dreams. So Don Bosco always talks about Francis de Sales, but one thing that he was sorry, he didn't write a life of St. Francis de Sales. Don Bosco wrote many books, over 150 books, and he had magazines, the Catholic Readings. And then at the general chapter, the second general chapter in 1874, he says, oh, sadly, I haven't written anything about Francis de Sales. So at the general chapter, all those provincials and directors and rectors, and they raise their hand and say, we will publish a life of Francis de Sales. We will translate his writings for young people. And so they make that resolution and they do nothing. And Don Bosco, that's 1874, 14 years later, Don Bosco dies in 1888 and nothing happened. And then they all felt guilty. So in the next year, 1889, 3 biographies of Francis de Sales were published by the Salesians. And from that time on, they began to study Francis de Sales, his writings, but also his teachings. Look at his teachings and be systematic about it, but also promote his gentle style of pastoral action. And this is what the Salesians have done. And that's as their tribute to St. John Bosco. So I wanted to leave you with this, and hopefully this makes some sense for everybody. So there it is. Why Don Bosco chose Francis de Sales? Because he's a model of gentleness and pastoral charity. So I hope this is something good for you to reflect on during this retreat. Thanks so much for putting up with me during these days.